What did your teacher do that you did not realize until you were older was messed up? When I was in the third grade, I had a teacher named Miss Thompson. She was known around school for being strict but fair. Her classroom was filled with colorful posters and student artwork, which made it look lively and inviting. Miss Thompson's way of teaching was straightforward and seemed to be well organized, but as a child, I never thought too much about her methods. I was an average student, not particularly good at math, but very fond of reading. Miss Thompson always seemed to have a way of pushing my buttons, especially when it came to math. I remember the long, boring worksheets and the tedious multiplication tables that seemed endless. Miss Thompson would often say, "Math is important for your future," and though I didn't understand it then, I knew she was serious about it. One thing that stood out was her motivation wall. She would place a star sticker next to a student's name whenever they did something she thought was commendable. The wall was a kind of competition to see who could collect the most stars. As a competitive child, I really wanted to see my name on that wall with lots of stars, but it seemed like an impossible task. One day, Miss Thompson announced a surprise quiz on multiplication tables. I was nervous but determined to do my best. After the quiz, she started handing back the papers, but instead of giving them back individually, she posted the grades on a big chart in front of the class. The chart had columns with names and rows with grades, and everyone could see how everyone else did. I was devastated to see that my grade was at the bottom of the list. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Miss Thompson didn't say much about it, but I noticed the looks from other students and felt the sting of embarrassment. My only consolation was that Miss Thompson said we could do better next time, and she encouraged us to work harder. Years passed, and I moved on to higher grades. By middle school, I had mostly forgotten about Miss Thompson's classroom, except for the occasional memory of the motivation wall and the public grade chart. But then, during a high school psychology class, we started talking about different teaching methods and their impacts on students. Our teacher explained various educational approaches and how some practices could affect students' self-esteem and motivation. She mentioned that public shaming, like posting grades for everyone to see, could lead to anxiety and a lack of self-worth in students. As I listened, I suddenly had a flashback to Miss Thompson's classroom. I realized that her methods, while perhaps well-intentioned, were not as positive as I had once thought. The public chart of grades, the constant comparisons, and the pressure to compete for stars were more about creating competition than fostering genuine learning. Miss Thompson's strictness and her focus on rewards and public recognition might have pushed some students, including me, to perform better in the short term, but they also created a lot of unnecessary stress. I began to understand that Miss Thompson's methods were problematic. The public display of grades made students, including me, feel ashamed and embarrassed, and the competition for stars created an environment where it was easy to feel like a failure if you didn't measure up. I had never realized how much this affected my feelings about math and school in general. Looking back, I saw that while Miss Thompson was trying to motivate us, her approach didn't always consider how it might impact each student individually. Some students thrived under pressure and competition, while others, like me, struggled and felt inadequate. This realization didn't just make me think about Miss Thompson's methods. It made me reflect on how different teaching approaches can impact students. I became more aware of how important it is for educators to understand the needs of each student and to create a learning environment that supports all kinds of learners. In college, I even took a few education courses where we discussed various teaching strategies and their effects. I learned about different ways to motivate students without causing undue stress or anxiety. It was fascinating to see how modern teaching approaches focus more on encouragement, individual support, and creating a positive learning environment. I often think about Miss Thompson and her motivation wall. I understand now that her intentions were to encourage us to do our best, but her methods were not as effective as they could have been. It was a valuable lesson for me, one that helped shape my understanding of education and how important it is to consider the well-being of students. Even though Miss Thompson's methods were flawed, I can appreciate the effort she put into teaching. It was a part of my educational journey, and it taught me to look beyond the surface and think critically about the systems and methods we encounter in life. In the end, I learned that sometimes what we think is normal or just a part of growing up can have deeper impacts than we realize. It's essential to reflect on these experiences, understand them, and use that understanding to make better choices in the future, whether as a student, teacher, or even just in everyday life.